A woman lies in a Vienna hospital bed, too weak to lift her own head, and the nurse leaning over her has not come to help. For 6 years, on one ward of this hospital, 4 nurses held that same power over the patients in their care. The city would come to call them angels. 42 deaths were eventually tied to them. The true number may be far higher. And the question this whole story turns on is not how they did it. It is why. Why would someone who chose to care for the dying start choosing who dies? Linz General Hospital had stood on the western edge of Vienna since 1839, one of the largest in the city, calm and respectable. Inside it, Pavilion 5 was the ward nobody wanted to think about, set aside for the very old and the very difficult. These were patients in their 70s and 80s, many of them dying, some confused, some simply hard to manage. Some had families who visited often. Others had outlived nearly everyone, with few left to ask questions when they died. In a place like that, death was ordinary. It came often, and when it came, it surprised no one. By day, the ward ran on doctors and routine. By night, it emptied out, and oversight thinned to almost nothing. And it was here, when the corridors fell quiet and the supervisors went home, that the killing would begin. Her name was Waltraud Wagner. She was 23, a nurse's aide, with no medical license to give a single drug. She was capable and confident, the sort of worker a short-staffed ward leans on, and at night, the ward was almost hers alone. In 1983, a woman of 77 lay on that ward in constant pain, and she begged Wagner to put an end to her suffering. Wagner agreed. She gave the woman an overdose of morphine, and she watched her go. If the story ended there, it would be a sad, complicated one about suffering and the edges of the law. But something happened inside Wagner that night that had nothing to do with the patient's pain. What she felt next, by her own later account, was not horror, but the pull of power, and she found that she liked it. That moment is the hinge this whole story turns on, and we will come back to it. Wagner did not keep the feeling to herself. Over the following months, she drew in 3 other aides from the night shift. Maria Gruber was 19, a nursing school dropout and a young single mother, still unsure of herself. Irina Lydolf was 21, married, but happiest in the other's company, quick to follow Wagner's lead. And Stefanija Meyer was 43, a divorced grandmother who had come from Yugoslavia, the steady, motherly one. Together, they worked the same dark hours, and what had felt monstrous the first time began, with each repetition, to feel like routine. At first, the method was simple. An overdose of morphine or insulin or tranquilizers slipped into a body already failing. But Wagner grew bolder, and she devised something that left almost nothing for a doctor to find. They called it the water cure. And here, the reason for that first image becomes clear. The method needed 2 of them. One to hold the patient still, the other to pour until the lungs filled. To a doctor examining the body later, it looked like the fluid that gathers naturally in the dying old. It was, in the ward's cold arithmetic, almost a perfect method because it left no proof a crime had happened at all. A method that left nothing for a doctor to find, on a ward where death was already expected. So how was anyone ever caught at all? We will get to that, but it only makes sense once you see what the ward had quietly become. It was no longer a dying patient begging for release. It was about whether a patient had become, to the nurses, a nuisance. A man who snored through the night, a woman who soiled her sheets, a patient who pressed the call button at the wrong hour. Refusing medication could be enough. Talking back could be enough. Wagner had a phrase for it. This one gets a ticket to God. The victims were no longer only the dying. Many were simply old, frail, and inconvenient to a busy night shift. This is what the opening image really was. Not a nurse helping a patient die, but a nurse deciding a patient was inconvenient. Among themselves, the staff began to whisper a darker name for the ward. And still, no one reported a thing. And the rumors were not new. They had circulated on the ward for at least 2 years before anyone outside finally acted. By the winter of 1989, the killing was neither rare nor careful. It had become routine, almost casual. One of the patients they killed that season was Julia Drapel, an elderly woman with a stubborn streak and a sharp tongue. Drapel had refused her medicine and insulted Wagner to her face. For that, she was marked for the following night. She was not dying, she was simply not compliant, and by now, that was the only qualification the ward required. Days later, the four women sat in a tavern near the hospital, drinking and laughing about the way Drapel had died. At the next table sat a doctor. What he heard was not gossip about a patient, but four aides joking about a killing. He went to the police, and the slow machinery of an investigation finally began to turn. For about 6 weeks, detectives quietly gathered records and traced the pattern of deaths on Pavilion 5. The lead investigator would later describe what he met inside the hospital itself. Not cooperation, but a wall of silence. Administrators stalled. Records were slow to surface. The institution seemed to wish the whole question would disappear. An earlier inquiry in 1988 had been quietly shut down. Investigators believed 22 people might have lived if it had not. In April 1989, all four women were arrested and the confessions began. Between them, they admitted to dozens of deaths. Then, as the reality of it set in, they began to take the words back, each pointing toward Wagner. Which leaves a harder question, and I will want your answer by the end. Were these four killers who hid behind mercy, or something stranger than that? In March 1991, nearly 2 years after the arrests, and 8 years after the first death, the four stood trial in Vienna. The case convulsed Austria. Vienna's mayor branded them the Death Angels, and the country argued over how its hospitals had let it happen. Wagner was convicted of 15 murders, 17 attempted murders, and 2 counts of assault, and sentenced to life. Ladoff was convicted of 5 murders, and also given life. Mayer received 20 years, Gruber received 15. The courts could prove 20 murders. The official toll was 42. They had confessed to as many as 49, and some estimates reached 300. And then the ending turns strange. Because in Austria, a life sentence does not always mean a life. By 2008, after roughly 17 years, all 4 women had quietly been released from prison. Which leaves the question this whole channel exists for. Not what these 4 women did, but how a person talks themselves into it. Cold logic. The why. We will follow it one step at a time. Start with the part that looks almost defensible. A dying woman in real pain begged to die, and Wagner agreed. What she took from that night was not guilt. It was a conviction that she was fit to judge when a life was no longer worth living. We have already watched the rule change from the outside. The harder question is how she herself never noticed it changing. The answer is that the word never changed. In her own mind, she was still being merciful. Mercy simply widened to cover anyone she wanted gone. From the inside, every death still felt like care. She was restoring calm, sending one more patient to what she called a free bed with the good Lord. That is the coherent, monstrous core of it. She did not feel like a murderer. She felt like someone doing a hard, necessary job. But a clean story of mercy cannot explain what these 4 did next. Mercy does not gloat. It does not sit in a tavern and laugh about how a frightened old woman died. They relived their killings over drinks, for sport. Wagner admitted she enjoyed the power, and that is the tell. Because if this were only mercy, there would be no thrill in it. The thrill is the proof that deciding who died was itself the reward. And 4 of them made it possible, where one alone might have stopped. Each death lowered the bar, and no one would be the one to refuse. We should be honest about the limits here. We are reading minds through confessions later retracted, by 4 women each pointing at the others. So this is a reading, not a diagnosis. The true inside of these 4 people is closed to us for good. But the shape is clear enough, and it is not the one we like to reach for. There is no childhood wound here doing the work. The trauma story does not fit. What powered this was 2 ordinary things fused together. The certainty that she knew who was better off dead, and the quiet pleasure of being the one who decided. If that is the kind of question you want followed all the way down, this is the channel that does it. Subscribing helps. The hospital that looked away became in time a nursing home, and the ward where it happened was folded quietly into the past. The 4 women lived out their lives in freedom. The names of most of the people they killed were never recorded at all. That is the part worth sitting with. Not the method, not the number, but how small and reasonable that first step looked. So, the question I left you with: were they killers who hid behind mercy, or 4 people who never once felt like killers? Tell me below. There is a related case waiting in the playlist on screen, and another coming soon. Until then, this was Cold Logic Crime. The why is the whole point.